Around the 80s and the 90s, the world starts to take off. At that time in the 90s, I'm in your shoes, the internet hits. When the internet hits, boom, suddenly we moved to a whole world of client server. Client server was really exciting because it actually put a computer on everybody's desk. It put a computer in pretty much every company's storeroom. Everybody was able to kind of run their own network. Suddenly we've moved from centralization to decentralization. Client server was pretty amazing. Cranks all the way through the 90s, and pretty much every single company, any job that you got, if you graduated in the 90s or in the early 2000s, was fundamentally based on client server technology. That world still, by the way, makes up about 50% of all businesses today. So you're still going to be walking into some aspect of client server. Sure enough, here come the 2000s. And it was a little bit before 2000, but good old Amazon. Amazon suddenly starts making books available to consumers. That is ultimately the first cloud. The first enterprise cloud, which I had the pleasure of being a part of, was really Salesforce. The happy little cloud literally starts marketing the cloud to business, and the whole thing explodes. So what fundamentally does the cloud mean? The cloud means nothing, and the cloud means everything. The cloud ultimately means a single network and a single set of data storage, processing storage, where all of the users, all of the companies, everybody who accesses it, accesses a single entity. And I can tell you, for 10 years, we battled about what the cloud was all about. And that magic number, the magic word was really multi-tenant company. If everybody shared the same cloud, the same platform, I got massive economies of scale. Everybody would be on the same version of software. I could move everybody forward the way that we move everybody forward on your mobile devices today. I could operate thousands and thousands and thousands of customers' software far cheaper than trying to maintain and manage an individual network or infrastructure for them. So the economic model was amazing for the vendor. At the same time, for the companies, and I mentioned earlier with that mainframe, only the big mega corporations could afford a mainframe because it was millions. Suddenly they could be paying a few $100s per user per month, and they could pay as they go. Why was that important? Because it actually drove accountability into the software market. Many of you guys are going to be going into your career thinking, hey, I want to make money, I want to do something fulfilling, and maybe I want to make a difference. When you go out there, you'll actually find there's a lot of companies that are just out there to make money. Software, enterprise software, was very much like that. We wrote a lot of software, we shipped you out a bunch of software on a disk, and we charged you about $1 million for that piece of enterprise software. And then what we said was, install it, update it, manage it, good luck. And that software often was even filled with bugs because it was millions and millions and millions of lines of code. So why did pay-as-you-go and cloud fundamentally shift the model? Because it drove accountability. The vendor not only had to write the software, but they had to operate the software. And we know today that's the model. Nobody writes software today that they charge for that they don't end up operating and managing. And that's the big change in the cloud. Finally, automated upgrades, but it scaled with you. It meant that if I added 500 customers, the next year I could add 5,000 customers. The next year I could add 500,000 customers. The fact is there are absolutely no limits to the cloud because the economy of scale of the data centers that we could build are so massive that I could support any computing challenge going forward. Fundamentally, it changed every single metric around data and technology and digital business. So much so that very quickly, every single company started to think, do I need to bring in cloud computing? And to this day, about 50% of all businesses are running on some level of cloud computing. Now, what was fun about this is that if you wanted to sell software in the early 2000s, and I know that seems like a long time ago, but it's 2 decades ago, and at some level it still exists, you had to be a multi-million, if not a multi-billion dollar company. By 2005, because of the economics of the cloud, what that means is that anyone who wanted to start a software company could. Instead of having to go out there and buy massive amounts of hardware, buying massive amounts of networks, buying a bunch of guys that could connect all of that, and then jumping onto the internet and trying to build your business, you could build your business on the cloud. That meant that we had infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, integration as a service. Every kind of business service was suddenly available on the cloud. This started up the internet 2008. That's the big boom. Of course, we see a bust right around 2010, only to be followed up with one that we're in the middle of, the last decade of real technical innovation in software, all built on the cloud. We're not talking about hundreds of startups anymore. This is thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of cloud companies. Big benefit for you guys. When you get out, it's not like you need to join the big 5 software companies anymore. There are so many opportunities in every single space because the vast majority of companies are built on the cloud, and ultimately the cloud and your digital experience will be their differentiator of whether your company wins or loses going forward. This gives you an idea of every single industry across the world as it shifted into the cloud. Notice I picked something from 6 years ago. You can see that whether you're in education, retail, government, hospitality, everything in enterprise software, and we all followed the consumer software market that you use on your phones, everything has shifted to the cloud. Now, with that comes the new giants. Every single person who's in this presentation will recognize these logos. Even Salesforce, which is the one that I came in originally, Salesforce, which represents a $30 billion company, is struggling to compete with a group of about 4 to 6 cloud giants. The only one that I didn't include that I probably should have would be Alibaba. Your generation is going to look at the cloud in a totally different way. I talk about what happened over the last 20 years. These giants are the ones that have the finances, and they can afford the massive data centers that will power the next 10, possibly the next 30 years of business and personal computing. Amazon, we all know the power, and we can feel the power of Amazon as we go through the pandemic. Microsoft, as it shifted to its new CEO with Satya, right behind AWS. Google, obviously very, very powerful for search. Believe it or not very good in the enterprise software market, but rapidly catching up with incredible analytics capabilities. Those are the big 3. Oracle, probably a dead dinosaur. We'll see what happens, but maybe there's a little breath of life. IBM, probably also a dead dinosaur, but pretty good commercials. I would encourage you guys to look at the big 3, but understand the ramifications of all of that data, all of that processing power living within 3 major entities. Add Alibaba, and you've got 4 people that will maintain and manage and store the world's data for the rest of your lifetime. Enter the connected world. You guys were born in the middle of this. When I was young, no cell phones. We had to say, hey, I'll meet you down at this bar. I'll meet you at this club. Whatever it was, everything was manual. Everything was by voice. At this point, 50 billion devices have been attached to the cloud. The cloud is essentially a small microcosm of the internet. The shift is if the cloud created those centralized services that you could plug into, the next wave is the Internet of Things. 50 billion devices, you've all seen the different devices. that number will very quickly, within about 5 to 7 years, be as much as 500 billion devices, and it will keep going. Your generation will live in a level of connectivity that no one on this planet can fully fathom. And you've got to think of what are the ramifications, both for me as a human being first, but also me in terms of my career. Now, with all those devices, collecting all of that data, that's ultimately the story that I would take you to with cloud computing. If cloud computing essentially repeated history, it took the centralization and the economy of scale of that mainframe. It suddenly brought all of that into the cloud with unlimited processing and unlimited storage power. We suddenly start to see what's happening in collecting all of that data and storing it in what could be many, many, many different clouds, or actually a consolidated group of clouds that are behind the scenes in the big mega data centers. The idea that we have 175 zettabytes of data that are stored globally, the idea that we even have a term called a zettabyte is zany in and of itself. I've gone way past the point of trying to explain what a petabyte was, and that was just a decade ago. And it's by the time you get to a zettabyte, you're talking about something that's 10,000 times one of those. The bottom line is that the overall amount of data that's being collected from that Internet of Things and from the cloud is astronomical. Every single piece of data in the human's existence will be captured, and it will be replicated 5 times over every single year for the rest of your life. Bottom line for your careers and for the rest of your life, try to get your head around the power of data, because that's where the real power in the universe, that's where the real power on this planet will be, is who stores the data, but more important, who analyzes and has access to that data, because behind all that data comes the new world of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the algorithms that are being trained today that will go operational over the next 5 to 10 years. So finally, to kind of finish up, does history really repeat itself? We talked about the mainframe moving to the decentralized client server. Then that moves to this world of the centralized cloud. The centralized cloud, again, goes decentralized as we go to tens of thousands of smaller clouds, only to find out that the vast majority of those clouds are again consolidated by 5 to 6 vendors again. So does that happen? Before I actually go into whether it happens or not, let me tell you first, I'm not sure. But one piece of advice that I would give you, and I think I saw in that last poll that about 45% of you are juniors or seniors looking to graduate. I had no idea when I was in your shoes. I have a better idea now, but I still don't know. I've lived my entire career with only one thing that could be for certain. I knew change was coming. I knew that the majority of human beings that I was competing with, whether in my personal life or my business life, don't like change. We just don't like change. We saw it in the elections. We see it all over the place. My recommendation, if you want to do well in your career, have an infinite amount of curiosity and accept change. Ride the wave. If you see something like the cloud, ride it. It will be amazing. It's eye-opening. I would rather be inside one of these movements to make sure that good people are managing it and building it than be on the outside and be crushed by that wave on the sand of the beach. Now, if you want to read a book, and this is an old book, it's 10 years old, but when I read it, I could not believe the tide. The Big Switch by Nicholas Carr captured it perfectly. Nicholas Carr writes essentially that what happened with cloud computing is analogous and it's a repeat to what happened with earlier electrical systems. I don't know how many of you guys actually paid attention during history class, but this whole internet thing, this connectivity thing, this digitalization thing did happen before. It happened when the United States and the rest of the world went to the electrical grid. Suddenly, every single factory that had to create its own power sources, that's why all the factories were on the rivers. That's why they were next to running water. They could run their own generators, thereby running all of their own machinery. That meant that everything was unique that they built, and they had to have armies of electricians just for their factory alone. All of that shifted. There was massive geographical change across the United States, across the world, as people were able to move away from those factors, away from those rivers, and be able to do anything, anywhere as they plugged into the grid.